My name is Dave Haugen, and I've been part of the oil and gas industry starting back in the 1970s when I went to work initially on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline project. I first came to Alaska right after the earthquake in 1964 when I was assuming that there would be some readily available work on the rebuilding of Anchorage with all the earthquake damage. Didn't turn out to be the case. There were still aftershocks occurring, so I took another job, which was very fortunate, up in McKinley Park, and I was a surveyor the entire summer up there. And that was with the Bureau of Public Roads, which at that time was doing most of the road construction in Alaska, even though the state of Alaska had become a state in '59. They were still not getting the work done on the highways. That was still being done primarily by the feds. So in the summers of '64, '65, and '66, I was still going to engineering school back at the University of North Dakota, and then I enlisted in the Army during the Vietnam days from '67 to '69, and I finally then did return to Alaska on a full-time basis in 1969. Originally, I was born and raised in Minnesota, and went to school back there in a small town, and then attended college and university back there. I first became aware of the oil, the real big find, in 1968 when the discovery well was announced. At that particular point in time in my life, I was in the U.S. Army back at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where I was stationed. But when I heard that news, and given my earlier work I had done in Alaska, I was determined to come back. So the minute I got released from active duty in 1969, I then returned to Alaska to come back and try to get involved on the pipeline itself. All the hype that was already starting up on terms of how big a project it was going to have to be and the amount of money that was going to be spent, it seemed to me to be an ideal opportunity for me to get involved with. And so I was very fortunate that I did get lucky and was able to do that. Well, initially I first came to Fairbanks and worked up there briefly for a contractor until about the first of the year. I came down to Anchorage in January of 1970 and went to work for then the State of Alaska Department of Highways as a traffic engineer. But I was there only 6 months when I got word that there was a few surveying contracts that were being let to survey the pipeline. So I gave notice, and in early May of 1970, I signed on with a survey company here in Anchorage, Ocean Technology Limited, and went to work on the pipeline surveys. And Ocean Tech, as we called it, had been given the survey contract to survey the pipeline route from the Yukon River down to Valdez. And another company, Michael Baker Jr., was hired to survey the pipeline route from the Yukon River north to Prudhoe Bay. So that's when I went to work initially on the pipeline as a surveyor. When I first went to work as a surveyor, we started out at Copper Center, and the initial survey work that had to be accomplished was what we call control surveying, where you have to establish all the reference points along the pipeline right-of-way that enables you to ground truth where the pipeline is going to actually be constructed. So that work was done primarily from helicopters, jumping from mountaintop to mountaintop, and then staking out the initial, what are called points of intersection along the pipeline route. So we started at Copper Center and worked our way all the way down to Valdez, doing that most of the summer of 1970. This work can be done year-round, although it gets more difficult, especially with the snowfall and then starting to battle the extreme cold. But to start with, on the control surveys, we basically got that work done before we got to Valdez with all of that prior to the snow starting to fall. Then the work shifted from what the control survey was all about into actually staking out the pipeline route on the ground when you march from one point of intersection to another. And that's when it's really on the ground. You have to clear the actual pathway, the right-of-way, and stake it out. And that's when the weather was turning in the fall, and it starts to get cold, and then you're battling the elements as well as also cutting the trees that are in the way, the brush that's in the way, and then watching out for the critters at the same time. The surveyor, above all people, gets to really understand the ground truthing the first time through. And yes, there were very significant obstacles all along the way, from river crossings to the terrain itself. And in particular, for our part of the route, it was going over the top of Thompson Pass and the Keystone Canyon down by Valdez. Those are extremely difficult grades and very steep. And as we were doing the survey work on that, all of us were talking about how difficult the construction work was going to become when it became time to actually do the construction itself. That turned out to be the case. No, I actually stayed with the construction surveying all the way up to surveying it up around Fairbanks and north all the way to the Yukon River. And that was basically the end of the survey effort. Then the pipeline itself went into kind of a pause when there was the court battles and other things were being fought. And several of those things were like the Native Land Claims Settlement Act that was passed in 71. There was also the NEPA law that was passed in 1970 that were all part of the pipeline enabling work. And then finally there was the vote in Congress. So it wasn't really started up until the vote in Congress was taken in 73. And I was at that time working for the United States Postal Service and wanted to get back on the pipeline. So I knew a friend that used to be a survey supervisor. He got me an interview, and I got hired directly by Alyeska Pipeline in May of 1974, and then went to work as an Alyeska employee at that time. Yes, in 1974, the initial assignment I had was to go to San Francisco, where on the pipeline side, Bechtel had been hired as the construction and management contractor. And I was sent to review all the bids that had come in on the pipeline contractors that were actually going to start to build the project. But I got pulled off of that within a matter of weeks to head up north of the Yukon River, because the construction of the haul road had gotten started. And that was a very dramatic time, because we built the haul road from the Yukon River up to Prudhoe Bay in a matter of 164 days. And that's a 400-mile-long road, which was really intense construction. But during the time that I'm up there on that construction work, Fairbanks has really turned into a hotbed of activity, because Fairbanks was the construction headquarters for the pipeline side of the Alyeska project. And that's where they moved on to Fort Wainwright, where they took over some of the military buildings, and that was where the headquarters was during the construction of the pipeline. Well, Fairbanks, even back in my early survey days in the 1970s, was always notorious for the amount of activity downtown Fairbanks. That's the infamous 2 Street, 2nd Avenue, that has a whole range of bars up and down both sides. And that was true in 70. And then when 74 came along, it became wild and crazy because of all the money that was coming in. The Alyeska ended up hiring over 2,000 separate contractors that employed all kinds of other people. It was virtually impossible in Fairbanks to get a telephone line. You could pick up a telephone, and it would take you 15 or 20 minutes to get a dial tone, because the telephone system was so overloaded with just the amount of traffic that was going on. But it was also crazy for housing. There were people that were renting out not just beds and couches, but the floor space in their houses for people, because there was so much activity with people trying to find a place to sleep. The bar scene was crazy as well. There were just every nook and cranny would seem to have a bar, and they were doing a land office business. And then there was no shortage of ladies of the night that were there as well, that were plying their trades in those bars as well. So it was a crazy place, and there was also a fair amount of altercations between individuals that would get out of hand, and then sometimes that would lead to fisticuffs and some bad behavior. I was stationed at it during the haul road construction in the first camp north of the Yukon River, which is called 5 Mile Camp, and that's when that's the first camp north of the Yukon, and then later I moved up to Old Man Camp, which we're all in what we call Section 4, which is about the first 150 miles north of the Yukon, and that was a spread that I had control over for the construction of the haul road. But I would go periodically back into Fairbanks because that's the headquarters location. So we'd fly back in, not every week, but maybe every couple of weeks to have staff meetings and other things that were going on in Fairbanks, and doing other things along with it. The original budget, after the original startup occurred in 1969 after the discovery well, was an $800 million project. But that had assumed that there would be a pipeline that could be built with ordinary lower 48 style construction, which means all 800 miles would be buried. Well, as the design got progressed, as well as the requirements under NEPA, the Native Land Claims Settlement Act, all these other things came together, it developed into a much more complicated project. So at the end of the day, the budget, by the time we completed it in 1977, was over $8 billion. But I think it's also important to recognize that over and above that amount of money, at least that amount or more was spent at Prudhoe Bay by all the operators at Prudhoe Bay at that time, BP and ARCO, to develop all the field activities. So if you put the two together, that's probably a total upfront capital cost of $15 or $16 billion. And in today's world, that's a huge amount of money. That's probably equivalent to more like $80 billion in today's money. Because of that, the schedule for the pipeline was schedule driven. We knew ahead of time that the one and only thing that had to be adhered to was bringing the project in on schedule so the oil could flow and that the owners could then get some reward for their capital that they'd invested. Well, at that time in 1977, actually some of us that had been on the pipeline formed up a company, and we got one of the first contracts to pursue a gas pipeline. So we worked initially for a company called Northwest Alaska Pipeline Company based out of Salt Lake City, and their proposal was to construct a gas pipeline from Prudhoe Bay down the Alcan Highway into Canada and then into the lower 48 states. So we spent about a year working on that project, and then it went from our original plan, and it was handed over to the Fluor Corporation, and then they pursued that for several years after that, before that finally came to a halt as well. Yeah, I actually worked as well for what was called the Denali Project for a couple of years, and that was a joint venture of ConocoPhillips and BP, basically similar to what was initially proposed by Northwest down the Alcan Highway. And when that was coming to an end, then the state of Alaska picked up the ball in 2010, and they formed the Alaska Pipeline Development Corporation. I went to work for them, and I was a senior project manager on the planning and the design work for the ASAP project, the Alaska Standalone Pipeline Project, which was a project to bring gas down from Prudhoe Bay down to basically to the Cook Inlet. And then a couple of years later, that same organization took on the responsibilities for the Alaskan LNG project, and I worked on that as well as a senior project manager on that until I retired finally a few years ago. Well, the gas pipeline is handicapped in a couple of ways. First of all, the gas that is at Prudhoe Bay that's currently being recycled, in order to make that usable for pipeline transmission, it has to be conditioned. And that conditioning facility is a pretty expensive plant all in and of itself. So that has to be added into the cost of the gas as it comes out of the ground at Prudhoe Bay. And then you've got an 800-mile long pipeline that you also have to construct before you can get it down here to the Cook Inlet, either for using it here in this area or for export as LNG. And if you lump that all together, the capital cost for that gas pipeline is more than what the current market can stand. It just doesn't pencil out economically. Now that's in today's market conditions, which given situations like what are going on currently in the Middle East, those market conditions could change, and either the ASAP project or the Alaskan LNG project could see something happening if the market price of the gas escalates high enough. I worked for the Linden Corporation for 22 years as a vice president for the Linden Incorporated. That's the holding company that owns the other companies that Linden has. And it was a very exciting time because Linden was diversifying into a lot of areas. That's when they got into the air cargo business and acquired the Lockheed Hercs that are still flying around. They got involved in air freight and marine operations as well. So I spent a fair amount of time there and really enjoyed being part of what was going on in the economy of Alaska, because Linden had its footprint over virtually the entire state with operations in just about every area of the state. When I was first here in the 1960s, Alaska was a very different place. There was nothing in the way of wintertime construction. When termination dust descended in the fall, that was time for a lot of Alaskan folks that would pick up and move south. I guess they were the first of the snowbirds, but that was because there was nothing going on in the wintertime. Very, very low level of activity. Once the pipeline came along and it changed all the dynamics of that, it changed that. But I think the major impact, of course, from the pipeline is the amount of revenue that has allowed that to have been brought to the state. I saw something where one estimate there's been over 180 billion or so dollars that's been refunded to the state in terms of taxes and things of that sort. And the impact of that is all over the state in the schools that are now in place, the population that's here that wouldn't have been here, the amount of buildings, things like the Sullivan Arena and the Performing Arts Center. None of those would have been here had that pipeline never started up operations. In 1983, I was appointed to the DOT Deputy Commissioner position here in Anchorage, and I held that for several years. And DOT has the responsibility for not only the highway system, but also all the airports that are in the central region, as well as both the major airport at Anchorage as well. So it was a very exciting time to be part of that. The state of Alaska is really, it depends an awful lot, of course, on the highway system for the Federal Highway Act that provides funding for highways, and then for the FAA with the federal highway when it comes to the airport side of the fence. But the state of Alaska still has to provide all the match money, it's called, to match up against those federal funding sources. But in addition, what people don't realize is how that the state of Alaska has to pick up the bill for all of the maintenance of all those facilities, whether it's highways, airports, ports, or whatever. And that's typically been a real difficult problem for the state of Alaska to come up with the money that's required to adequately finance all of the maintenance requirements for all those facilities. The money from the pipeline has certainly enabled that and helped out a lot. In 1989, when the oil spill occurred, I was working for Linden at that time, and we could see that there was going to be a significant requirement for a lot of the services that Linden could provide to assist in the cleanup activities, and that was all the way from having the Hercs that were equipped with spill dispersant spraying activities that could be done from them, to the marine applications where we provided barges, tugs, supply boats, and then on land we brought in a lot of the soiled material that was picked up and brought that back in and transported it here to Anchorage, where it was ultimately taken down for disposal in Arlington, Oregon. So it was a very, very fanatic time, again, with a lot of activity that Lyndon participated in, and we were heavily engaged in that for the a year or two that the spill cleanup was going on with. I think the state of Alaska without oil and gas would be a totally different world. It's just hard to imagine how much of an impact oil and gas has had. But from my early days in the 1960s, I can just relate to that and say that it would be a much more subdued pace of activity. There'd be much less activity all around, and the population would probably be 1/2 or less of what it is currently, because I think that the oil revenues have generated an awful lot of other things to occur that would never get done under ordinary circumstances. And so it's not the same now than it would have been without having the oil revenue. The original design for the pipeline was a 30-year life for the project, as well as that was the original assessment of the 10 billion barrels of oil at the original Prudhoe Bay Reservoir. Obviously, in both cases, that's been well exceeded. And I think it's a testament to the design work that went on the pipeline, as well as how it was constructed, that it's really got an infinite life to continue into the future. The pipe itself is well monitored. Any corrosion that's appearing is taken care of. The pump stations have all been reconfigured. So there's no real reason why the pipeline would ever have to cease operations. But it depends upon the throughput. And the issue on that is there has to be oil found at or near the where the pump station 1 is located to keep the oil flow going. Otherwise, it'll get to a low enough level where the pipeline will have to be shut down just because of lack of throughput. Well, if Willow and Pica and these other developments occur as they are showing their possibilities, I think that there is a good possibility for quite a long extended life for the pipeline if they can be brought online. And those are not the only developments that are up there. I think that there are other operators that are going to see the success of those two operations and then also try to get more production flowing. And all of that adds to the throughput. And like I say, as long as that throughput can be maintained, the revenue stream will be there and the pipeline will still function, and it'll benefit all the residents of the state of Alaska. I think the state of Alaska still has great potential. There are many more areas of Alaska that are largely unexplored that have shown some signs of oil and gas resources. And it isn't because they haven't been looked at prior to this time. It's because the market conditions weren't suitable for that. But in the 1960s even, there was oil exploration going on in the Gulf of Alaska, in the Aleutian Chain. Certainly way back in World War II, the more oil production or exploration was going on in NPRA up at the near Barrow. So there are many more basins that deserve now to probably have a better look. But it all depends upon the marketability, and the trick on that is getting the permitting and the land access available to be able to bring all those resources to market. If you can put it all together, then there's the possibility of other basins being developed as well, over and above the ones we already know about. The oil and gas industry has tremendously benefited my own personal situation. I have two sons that were born and raised here in Anchorage, and now I have two grandchildren as well. And I really take a certain amount of pride in the fact that due to the work that went on the pipeline and the revenue stream, that they've gotten the benefit of all of the facilities and things that have been made available to them. The school system that now has lots of resources that would never have been there before. The other activities, the recreational things that are available in Anchorage, the indoor hockey rinks, the cross-country skiing, the downhill skiing. All these things would never be here if it wouldn't have been for the revenue stream coming off the pipeline. And I really feel good that I had a hand in helping out on that, and my family can benefit from that.